Bring your friends and don't forget some cash.
Well said.
Okay, I just want to also just say, wonderful. It is really wonderful to be back. I personally can't stand giving shiurim on the Zoom screen, but so one for me my professional work. So it's a major flaw that I have is that I really am terrible remembering names. Just awful in terms of remembering names. I feel like you could have to put a little name tag under my mirror in the morning so I remember who I am sometimes. But so when anyone speaks up, if they could just remind me, just say first name, just to so we can revive the personal connection. Okay. So the next few shiurim, we have 4 weeks, Bezrat Hashem, between now and Pesach. So what I'm going to try to do is speak about a different aspect of the Chag as we go along, keeping to the minhag of the shiur, trying to connect it in some way to Parshu HaShavua. Sometimes we'll be more successful, maybe sometimes even more successful than that. We'll see. Where I wanted to start, basically, this week's Parsha touches upon it from 2 different perspectives. One, which I put on the sheet, is the pasuk in the after the story of the Chet HaEgel. So the Torah brings us a group of the mitzvot which already were spoken about in Perek Chav Gimel of Parshat Mishpatim. They're not the mitzvot of Mishpatim that we think of in terms of Mishpatim. They're not all of what those halachot that make up Choshen Mishpat, in terms of the laws of commerce and the like. There's a stream of different mitzvot, and the Torah repeats it again, except changes the order. I will leave it up to you. I mean, one of the questions is, first of all, why repeat it and why change the order? What are you going through each one of it? I don't have time to get into that. I will just say something that I've noticed, and I haven't seen anyone talk about it, is that if you take a look at the new order in Parshat Kitisa, so it seems to follow the chronological order of Am Yisrael from the beginning, if you will, of their Exodus until Matan Torah, which is not the same order as it was originally presented. And perhaps the Torah is presenting these mitzvot as a bit of a reset. In other words, the same that we're familiar with in terms of when we have to reboot our computers, whatever it might be. There's some glitch, and you say, okay, turn it off. Right, disconnect and start again, right? And so each mitzvah, I'm not going to go through it now. You can take a look at it over Shabbat as you're going through the Parsha. Seems to correlate with something going on the chronological timeline till they reach Har Sinai, and maybe that's what the Torah is trying to get at. But one of the mitzvot that is mentioned within the context after the Torah mentions the Shalosh Regalim, Torah tells us, Lo tishchat al chametz dam zivchi, v'lo yalin laboker zevach HaPesach. So do not shecht when and this is the way it's understood by Chazal, Lo tishchat, Rashi says, et HaPesach va'adayin chametz kayam. In other words, the Isur of chametz already begins on the 14th and not on the 15th when the actual Chag HaMatzot begins. L'shochet or l'zorek or l'achad mibnei chabura. In other words, it doesn't matter who owns the chametz at that point, whether it is the person who shechted the korban, or it's the kohen who is throwing the blood onto the mizbeach, or it's one of the members of the party for whom the korban is being sacrificed and being brought. Doesn't matter. All of those people are joining together, and all of those people have to be, as a result, ready for the Pesach. No chametz is allowed at that point. This is also the major source. I'm not going to talk about it. Maybe I'll talk about it in one of the subsequent weeks. This is also the major source for the idea that we are all familiar with, that we already get rid of our chametz on the 14th. Min Torah, it starts from the time that you could theoretically bring the Korban Pesach, which is at noon, at Chatzot. Rabbinically, because, especially since people are working without timekeeping devices and the like, so it was pushed up a couple of hours, so that way you can just look up in the sky and see where the sun is, and you're not going to say, oh, is it 11:55? Let me reset my sundial or whatever it is, but rather I'm going to, okay, the difference between 10 o'clock and 12 o'clock, that everyone can grasp, and that's where that din comes from, but it starts with this pasuk. Where else is Korban Pesach coming up? With regard to the second parsha that we're going to read, Parshat Parah. The reason why we read Parshat Parah at this junction is basically along the lines of reading the Parshat Shkalim, where we were saying, okay, this is the time where you're supposed to be bringing the Shkalim. This is also the time now to be thinking about becoming tahor, purifying yourself from tumat met, in order to be able to bring the korban come Pesach in 3 weeks' time or so. So that's the connection, if you will, to Korban Pesach. And what I want to focus on today is a question which comes up now and then, but also has had a tremendous amount of literature written about it. Really very fascinating. We'll explain what the catalyst for that literature was just in one moment. But the question of, can you bring a Korban Pesach today? Because we don't have a Beit HaMikdash. L'tzareinu, and Bezrat Hashem, there's still time. I sent a WhatsApp in the group, out to the Ribbon Shalom, waiting for Mashiach. We're there, ready to go. Fine. I haven't seen the 2 blue checks yet, but hopefully at least 2 checks are there so that it's been received. And but okay, will there be Korban Pesach this year? Bezrat Hashem. But okay, even if there isn't a Beit HaMikdash, can we bring the Korban Pesach? That's the question. Even today, and obviously in our world, I guess you could say, thank God to a certain extent, this has real-life political implications. And every year there's always someone who, tries to, I don't know if that's what he's trying to do, but almost creates a international incident by bringing a goat or a sheep up towards Har HaBayit on Erev Pesach. And so is this just someone who is, totally clueless, or is this something which at least halachically has something to stand on, that in theory you could bring a Korban Pesach today? So I'm going to focus on all of not all, by any means. As I said, there's a great deal of literature written about it, but an overview of the major issues that are involved to talk about it. Now, by way of introduction, the Makorot will start, as you see, from that Aleph underneath. But beforehand, there is already 2 particular junctures which you can point to in the last 1,000 years, or the last 700 years or so, 750 years, that this perhaps comes up. So in the Sefer Kaftor V'Perach, Kaftor V'Perach was written by Ishtori HaParchi. He was a person who was born in Provence, and he was in 1306. There was an expulsion long before the expulsion from Spain. There was an expulsion from France, of southern France in particular, but in Provence, a major Jewish community, really rivaling Sfarad, which is just to Barcelona, and that area is Catalonia is just to the west of Provence, and of course you have the northern France and Germany, but a community in terms of its importance in medieval Jewish history, which rivaled either of those communities. Many of the great Rishonim came from there. So that came to a close, a total close in the beginning of the 14th century. The people moved back, but more or less, the major figures were no longer there, with some exceptions, but that's another discussion. In any event, he left as a young man in his late 20s, and he traveled, and he also reached Eretz Israel. He passed away. He lived in Beit Shan, of all places, but his work, the Kaftor Vaferach, is partially a halachic work, as well as a geography of Eretz Israel. I mean, the word Kaftor Vaferach, taken from the menorah, is also a play on his own word, on his own name, Parchi. So but many of the much more recent attempts to try to piece together where biblical sites were, etc., begin with his work, because he's predating things by 700-800 years, and the place names that he has already is much more current. In any event, he speaks about when he came to Yerushalayim. So he comes to Yerushalayim somewhere in the, I'm not sure exactly when, but in the we'll say the 13th, let's say about 700 years ago, in the 1320s. He comes to Yerushalayim and he says, Gam ki amar alai Rabbeinu Baruch, who's speaking to Rabbeinu Baruch, Yerushalayim. There was a group of Baalei Tosafot who had actually come to Eretz Israel earlier, when you are, if you visit Akko, so you can, there was a community there. When you're walking in the Templar sites, you can imagine them walking those same places. Yerushalmi k'she'aveti alav zeh hasefer la'avor alav u'la'agiyah. So I had already written a draft of this sefer, and I brought it to this Rabbeinu Baruch to get his opinion on it. So he told me, Rabbeinu Yechiel de Paris. Rabbeinu Yechiel of Paris was a major Baal Tosfot. He was the Rabbi of amongst others, Rabbeinu Meir Rutenberg, and he lived in the mid to end of the 13th century. So he's about 70 years before this. Rabbeinu Yechiel de Paris Amar Lavoli Yerushalayim. So when he wanted to come with this group of Tosafos to Eretz Yisrael, he dreamt of coming to Yerushalayim. V'hu bishnat, he gives us the exact year, Shva Esrei Elef Hashishi. So that's the 17th year of the 6th millennium. So that is 1257. V'shiyikrav korbanot bizman hazeh. He wanted to bring korbanot when he came to Yerushalayim. Now, the city was still, at that point, was under Crusader rule. Va'ani mitir dati lahashlim imam lacha. So he, meaning the Kaftor Ferach, looking back at this conversation, he says, I was so concerned about my own book. I had to get I had to get it to the printers. Obviously, no printers then, but I had to get it out. I wanted to finish it. So lo sha'altiv ma na'aseh mitumatenu va'ana hakohen amiyuchas. Because I didn't ask the halachic questions that needed to be asked. How could Rabbeinu Yechiel even want to bring a korban Pesach? There's no Beit HaMikdash, and he doesn't ask. Well, there's no Beit HaMikdash. That doesn't seem to bother him, but he is concerned by the fact that we are tmeim. We are impure. We've all been exposed to dead people over the course of time, but in cemeteries, dead people in rooms. We all, even if we even if we weren't sure, Middle Ages probably everyone is sure, but today also virtually everyone in one way or another has come into contact at some point. It is tamei. We couldn't bring a korban. The Ana Kohen Miyuchas, and how do we know at this point in the mid of the 13th century who's really a Kohen, who's not a Kohen? Even people who think they are Kohenim, are they really Kohenim? And how could they bring the korban? Right. So I didn't ask the questions. Like I said, really? Rabbeinu Yechiel Paris really wanted to do that? That's very interesting. But I didn't ask, the nitty-gritty of how could it be done. Apparently, we don't have any record of it actually happening. Even Rabbeinu Baruch doesn't say, and he did it, right? But he does say that he wanted to do it. Presumably, once he got to Yerushalayim and saw the conditions, so he realized it wasn't possible, right? But it never happened. But the fact is that Rabbeinu Yechiel at least went up and thought about it. So that's one juncture. A little bit later, meaning much later, in the 19th century. So an important figure, Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer. So he published a work called the Drishat Zion, which the latest edition of which I put a little picture of there on the book. It's printed today by Mosad Rav Kook. You can buy it, and it was actually a work which developed over time. He published it in the I think in the 1850s. He was a Talmud of Rabbi Akiva Eger and of Rav Yaakov Lisa, who was the author of the Netivot HaMishpat. It was basically the two most important Rabbanim and Poskim of in Poland, or they're in Posen, they're in the area which is today is in Poland, but then I guess you could say they were no. It'll come to me which area. But be that as it may, two of the by far most important poskim of that era, Rabbi Akiva Eger was the father-in-law of the Chassam Sofer, and who will hopefully reach in a minute or two. And he already was, later on, he was a proto-Zionist, Rav Kalischer. So he was pushed various agenda items which we would recognize as being religious Zionist agenda, which of course didn't exist at the time. This is in the post-Napoleon era. This is when you have more favorable conditions developing in Europe. The Enlightenment has started. All sorts of things that are going on. And he asked Rabbi Akiva Eger, he didn't ask him, he sent him a proposal for reestablishing korbanot today. And part of his earlier work, which was incorporated into the Drishat Zion actually, was he wrote a letter to the Rothschilds to try to get funding for this proposal. But the idea basically was to purchase Har HaBayit and to perhaps begin rebuilding a Beit HaMikdash and starting korbanot. And he lays it out in the Drishat Zion. He also brings some of the critique. This triggered a tremendous amount of literature. As Rabbi Akiva Eger wrote to him, telling him that he didn't think that it was possible for various reasons that I go point by point. His the way that he dealt with the halachic issues, he had his critique. The Chassam Sofer chimed in, other Talmidim, and it generated literature really, maybe even to this very day, discussions that are on. So that is where a great deal of the issues that came up. Okay, so that's just the background for you to understand that this isn't just some wild idea that Yehuda Susman's coming up with. This is something which has had a serious amount of halachic discussion over the course of the I'd say at least the last 170 years or so in terms of this. So now let's take a look at some of the issues inside. The first question is the question of, well, is there any earlier precedent to it? And if you take a look at the Gemara, it seems that we have pretty solid evidence that there were korbanot that were brought after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. So let's take a look at some of them.
They were brought to Yerushalayim?
In Yerushalayim. And we'll see. So let's take a look. So the The Mishnah in Masechet Eidiot says the following: Amar Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Yehoshua, who's also going to be mentioned in a moment. So they are students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the leader of the Sanhedrin, Rosh of the Sanhedrin, at the time of the destructions. According to the story as passed down, they were the two students who carried out Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai from Yerushalayim when he feigned death in order to be able to speak to Vespasian. Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua are the two pallbearers, and they say the following: Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Shamati, Kishahayu bonim beheichal, osim klaim leheichal uklaim laazarot. So when they would build you have destruction, and you now need to rebuild. So how would they do this? So they would put up curtains for the heichal, meaning for the structure of the Beit HaMikdash itself, and curtains around the courtyard. In other words, to mark where these areas were. The heichal you would build from outside. In other words, you would put the line, and then you don't walk inside of the heichal while you're building, so you build it from the outside. U'v'azara bonim mibifnim. Amar Rabbi Yehoshua, and for the azara you can be standing on the inside and putting walls around. Amar Rabbi Yehoshua, Shamati shemakrivin af al pi she'en bayit va'ochlin kodshei kodshim af al pi she'en klei. So you can eat. You can bring the korbanot even if there isn't a Beit HaMikdash, and you can eat those sacrifices which are considered that need to be eaten inside the complex of the Beit HaMikdash, even if you don't have curtains delineating. If you know exactly where you're standing and you're standing within that area, you can eat it, even though there aren't any physical delineations around because they've been destroyed. Kachim kalimu maaser sheni afapi choma, which should be afapi she'en choma. You can be in Yerushalayim. Those are korbanot you have to eat inside Yerushalayim, inside the walls. Even if the walls have been knocked down, you can eat those korbanot. Shekedusha rishona kitcha l'shata v'kitcha la'atid lava. The reason for this being is that when Shlomo HaMelech sanctified the temple, so that kedusha remains, and that doesn't matter. The destruction doesn't impact on it. The Rambam paskins that opinion lahalacha. And he says in number 2, Lefikach makrivina korbanot kulan af al pi she'en sham bayit banui. The Rambam takes Rabbi Yeshua's statement and he codifies it. And he says, you do not need a Beit HaMikdash to bring korbanot. Va'oflin kachei kachim b'chol ha'azara af al pi shehi chareva. So you can eat kachei kachim in the entire on Har Habayit, again, not the entire mountain that we're familiar with, because that's been expanded, but within the area that's considered to be within the area of the Azara, you can do it. Even if there are no physical boundaries that are present right now. So the Rambam says it takes Rabbi Yeshua almost verbatim and codifies it lahalacha. Okay, he's speaking theoretically, right? Shamati shem makrivin, right? Did it actually happen? So here we have two stories of Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel is Rabban Gamliel. There are two Rabban Gamliels. There are more, but the two famous Rabban Gamliels. One who was the last of the Nisi'im before Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He seems to may have been killed during the revolt, or he just went into hiding, and that's why Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai took over. And his grandson, Rabban Gamliel of Yavne, who is living in the turn of the 2nd century, and he is one of the Rabbanim of Rabbi Akiva, so it's before the Bar Kokhba revolt, or rebellion, or rebelled, anyway, together. But anyway, the Bar Kokhba, but this is decades after the destruction, okay? And Rabban Yo, so he says the following: Ma'aseh Rabban Gamliel, Shahayo Shev al Gav Ma'ala Bahar Habayit. This is source number 3. So he was standing above the Harabait, overlooking Harabait. V'haya Yochanan sofer halaz omed lefanav, and he had a scribe named Yochanan who was with him. V'shalosh igrot chatuchot lefanav munachot, and he wrote at that point 3 different letters to 3 different communities. The first 2 are not important for us right now. And the third was the following: Tul igrata chada, so take a letter and write upon it. La'achana b'nei galuta beBavel, so to our brethren in Bavel. Ula'achana b'madai, ulishar kol galuta liYisrael. So I am writing this letter to the far-flung corners of the Jewish diaspora. Shlomchem yaskel alam, may you have great peace forever. Mahoda'an anachna lachon, so we are notifying you now. Gozlaya rikichin v'imraya arkin. So what that means is that the chicks, the hatchlings, have just hatched. They're still very young, and the sheep are still the baby sheep, the lambs are still thin. V'zimya da'aviva lomata, and spring has not yet come. Basically, it's about this time of year, except there hasn't been a global warming yet. It's been a cold winter, and the spring has not come. V'shafra milta ba'anpayu va'anpei chavirai va'osifet dalshata da yomin tlatin. So, based on our discussions here in Yerushalayim, we've decided to add another 30 days to the calendar. In other words, we have the set calendar where you add a month every 7 times every 19 years. The calendar hadn't been set yet, and it would be decided by the Chachamim in any given year, within certain limitations, whether you're going to add a month or not. We're deciding that we're going to add a month. But what's important here is that he didn't say, okay, the grain hasn't grown, etc. He brings the animals, and these animals are the animals that are necessary for the korbanot that were brought on Pesach. And that's the rationale that he's giving. He's basically saying the animals aren't going to be ready to bring korban Pesach. So as a result, we're adding another month, so that way, so we'll have animals for the korbanot. Okay, so that seems to be it. Another Gemara, number 4. The Mishnah actually. Mishnah says, Ketzat Solina Pesach. So how did they roast the korban Pesach? So Mevi'in Shvud Shal Rimon B'toch Volotoch Biv Ad Beit Nekuvato. You would have a spit made of pomegranate wood, which would be inserted from one end of the animal after it had been slaughtered to the other, and a discussion of how you would take out the inner organs. Okay, fine. But the last line is what's important for me, and then you would roast it on an open fire. Fine. Amar Rabbi Tzadok. Last line of the Mishnah. Maaseh b'Rabban Gamliel. Sha'amar l'tevi avdo. So there's a story where Rabban Gamliel told his servant Tevi, say utzlei lanu et haPesach al ha'askala. Go roast the Pesach on a grill. The Mishnah had spoken about how you do it on an open fire, on a spit, etc. So Rabbi Tzadok says, no, you can also do it on a grill, and that's the way that Rabbi Gamliel did it. Now, in both of these instances, and there are those who point this out, you can argue that this is actually the first Rabban Gamliel. That's why I mentioned that there were 2. That this is the first Rabban Gamliel, and this is happening during the time of the Beit HaMikdash. I can't say it's impossible. It's difficult to say it because we know that the second Rabban Gamliel had an Eved named Tevi. Right? We have no record of the first Rabban Gamliel having an Eved named Tevi. Is it possible that he did? Is it possible that in the relaying of the story that the name of the Eved was transposed? In other words, that he had Rabban Gamliel the first had an Eved named, Bob, and he told Bob to do whatever. But the next when the story was told, we know about a famous Eved named Tevi, and that's how it got. So it's possible. It's not 100% that you can say we have a clear indication that can't be argued that Rabbi Gamliel brought the Korban Pesach. However, that seems to be the case. We're talking about the second Rabbi Gamliel, and that he indeed brought the Korban Pesach. That's certainly the way that it was understood by Rav Yaakov Emden. Rav Yaakov Emden, living now a little bit more than a century before, not a little bit, I guess a little bit more, but basically a century before Rav Kalisher, who I mentioned before. So he picks up on this particular Gemara, and he says, you can understand it in one of two ways. Echad, dahanach tanai savrei Rabbi Eliezer v'siato, d'makrivin afal pi she'en bayit. That they agree with Rabbi Eliezer, it really should be Rabbi Yehoshua, but perhaps there isn't a machlok between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua in this regard, that you can bring the korbanot even though there is even though there's no Beit HaMikdash. And he says, if you skip a line to where the next bold print, Ulai haya adayin hamizbeach kayam ve'ikrivu korbanot tzibur. We know that Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. Was there a mizbeach that was left? So perhaps until the absolute destruction of Yerushalayim, and that takes place in the wake of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, when Hadrian plows over the city. That's the term that's used. Plows over the city, makes a total destruction, doesn't allow Jews to enter the city at all, changes the name from Yerushalayim to Elio Capitolina. The only day that the Jews are allowed to enter is on Tisha B'Av. And so then there was a total razing of what was on Har HaBayit. But before then, there was a shell of the Beit HaMikdash that was still there, the building, that the Mizbeach was there, wasn't totally operational, but people were able to bring korbanot. Perhaps that's one possibility. And then he says, Inabi, the other next bullet point, so perhaps this isn't an indication. He's talking about that first Gemara where Rabbi Gamliel said the sheep are still too young, and perhaps the Beit HaMikdash wasn't there, and they weren't actually bringing korbanot. But he's saying, listen, the same way that I started this year by saying, Bezrat Hashem, there's still time, we'll have a Beit HaMikdash, and we'll be able to bring the Korban Pesach. Rabbi Gamliel, living just decades after the Churban, and when we're going to see the Bar Kokhba rebellion is just around the corner, there's still very much a sense of trying to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash and rebel against Roman rule is in the air. So Rabbi Gamliel was saying, why are we adding a month? Because hopefully we'll be able to bring the Korban Pesach. So we want to make sure that that's a possibility, even though in reality they did not bring the Korban Pesach. However, he says at the end of that the second bullet point, "Umikol makom rishon ikar be'enai." The first idea, namely that this was actually in practice where they did bring the korban, that is what I think is true. And then he points out, he said, I just saw the Kaftor V'Ferach. Kaftor V'Ferach had been published. It was published in Venice in the 16th century. It wasn't particularly necessarily a well-published and common book in people's libraries. He said, but I just got my hands on a copy of the Kaftor V'Ferach, and I saw the story that we read earlier, and he's trying to figure out which korban was Rabbeinu Yechiel mi Paris even thinking about bringing. And he says it's very difficult to say that it would have been a korban tamid, right, the daily offering, because that would require getting everyone, the Jewish people, or at least the bulk of the Jewish people, to be contributing the chatzi shekel in order to purchase it. So that how possible is that, considering Jewish diaspora. That seems to be very difficult to even say. But then he says, if you flip to the next slide, into the bold, Achen yesh lomar shekorban Pesach bilvad shuvat salakri. Right, the korban that he wanted to bring was a korban Pesach. Right, and Moshe katav midati. Etc., that this is, you're able to do it, and we can show from the fact that the Chachmei of the Mishnah had brought it. However, he says, Omnam, Chachmei Talmud adayin haya lahem mechata. So let's think about it. There's a world of a difference between a Rabbi Gamliel, a Rabbi Yehoshua, just a few years, decades even, after the Korban, trying to bring a Korban. Because they still had somehow they still had saved the water with the ashes of a para aduma. In other words, they still had a possibility of purifying people. Gam nirelei sheim nitza kohen sheyesh biyado sefer yichsu mekuya maaseh beitin shavot havayim muchasim ad zman habayit dayo. In other words, they still had kohanim who could prove that they had the yichus to be kohanim and being able to serve in the Beit HaMikdash. Those people were still alive. Just to compare it to, let's say, our generation, right, and the previous generation of survivors from the Shoah. Was you still have people who you can talk to who can tell you about what was going on in Lithuania between the wars. What was happening, etc. And our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren don't have that anymore. So they still have that direct link to the Beit HaMikdash. ובזה יתיישב עוד דבר אחר נמצא לרבי גמליאל ומוסיף במבוכה. כי הלא משנה שלמה שענינו ריש פרק שישי דפסחים מעשה ברבי גמליאל שאמר לתביא עבדו צא וצלה לנו את הפסח להשכלה וזה בלי ספק רבן גמליאל דיאבנה שכן ידוע שתביא עבדו היה. So the Rabbi Yaakov Emden takes this idea of Tevi Avdo as being proof positive that we're talking about it. So, but he's saying you can't necessarily draw conclusions for us because they knew where the Mizbeach was. They could go to it, and perhaps the Mizbeach was still there. They still had Kohanim. They still had the Mechatat. So it's true they didn't have the Beit HaMikdash, but they had everything else. And we, and presumably Rabbi Yechiel Paris, over 1,000 years after the Churban, did not have that. So you can't prove anything from that you're able to recreate because you have to get over all of those hurdles. Yeah.
Well, they couldn't remember which way the menorah was. Was it this way or this way?
Okay, said but those are that's pishivkis, as it were. Okay, so now let's talk about the issue. So one of them we've already discussed, and this is the most basic one, and the idea which has to be accepted, namely that the kedusha of the Beit HaMikdash is still there. Now this is a machloket between the Rishonim who to follow, and we'll say that the majority opinion is along the lines of the Rambam, which we've spoken about before. However, if you take a look at the second paragraph in number 6, the Ravid disagrees and says that Amar Avram Shafilu LeRabbi Yossi Damar Kedusha Shnia Kitcha La'atid Lavo Lo Amar Ella L'Shar Eretz Yisrael. Okay, there's a general machloket whether the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is still applicable, and there it's the second Kedusha, the Kedusha of Ezra, and Bayit Sheni, which is the question, and that has implications for us today, for Shvi'it and for Trumot and Masrot, different discussion. Aval Yerushalayim ulemikdash lo amar. Lefi shahayodea Ezra shemikdash v'Yerushalayim atidim lishtanot ulitkadesh kiddush achar olmei b'chvod Hashem la'olam. Kach nigla li misod Hashem l'reyav. Lefikach hanichnas at Hashem ein bo karet. So the Ravid says the following. It says the the Kedusha, whether it's the Kedusha of Shlomo or the Kedusha of Ezra, those are Kedushot which were implemented on a conditional basis, as long as there is still a commonwealth here. But the moment that there is a destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, that Kedusha is canceled out. And therefore the Kedusha of Har HaBayit, even though if the surrounding Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is still there, nevertheless the Kedusha of Har HaBayit itself is no longer there. And he says, as a result, if you were to go into the Kodesh HaKodashim today, so you would not have a penalty of karet, of being cut off, because the Kedusha is no longer there. Yeah.
Is this still a machloket today, or is the halacha being decided on that issue?
So the assumption is, so we'll talk about this, but the majority opinion follows the Rambam. The assumption is that the Kedusha is still there. There are those who want to say you can rely on the Ravid, and there is in Kedusha. Now, in terms of our question, it's a double-edged sword, because what it means on the one hand is that because one of the biggest problems is going into a place in the Beit HaMikdash where you're, as if we were to go onto Har HaBayit today, and perhaps some people here in the audience have gone up to Har HaBayit. I personally have not. But if you go up to Har HaBayit, so you have to be very, very careful where you walk, where you can't walk, and it's based on a very strong, educated guess as to exactly what the boundaries were. So with almost 100% certainty, perhaps even 100% certainty, we know where the Beit HaMikdash wasn't. So the whole idea of people going up to Har HaBayit is to stay in the area where you know there wasn't a Beit HaMikdash, but it was the extension built by Herod. So if you're up there and you go to where you're not allowed to go, so according to the Rambam, so then that Kedusha is still there, and there is a chiyuv karet to go into that area. If you are following the Ravid, so then you can go in without the chiyuv karet. Now, there are those who will say that the Ravid never said it's permissible to go. All he did was say that you don't have the chiyuv karet. You don't have the severe penalty if you go there, and perhaps it's still forbidden to go there. But here, one of the people, Rav Kalisher, took the Ravid and said, you can go there. And this is long before they discussed the boundaries of where. With that discussion, only really started after the 6-Day War. Exactly where and it wasn't, because it wasn't a practical question. You said you don't go up to Har HaBayit. You have to determine that let's say, the Kotel is not one of the actual walls of the Beit HaMikdash, but is a support wall for the mount as a whole. And that's really all you need, right? If you're not going up there, it doesn't really matter where the Beit HaMikdash was or not. After 67, that becomes, thank God, a practical question. Where can I walk? Where can I not walk? What do you have to do? Etc. So Rav Kalisher says, even if you're going to go to the wrong place, according to the Ravid, you don't have a problem. So that, in other words, if you're concerned about the Tumah, you shouldn't be. Because it's sort of combining it. Now the question is, well, does that mean if they're according to the Ravid, is he disagreeing about about being able to bring korbanot? In other words, do you have to have the kedusha there in order to bring the korbanot? So you can argue. The Ravid never talks about the second halacha of the Rambam. The next halacha of the Rambam says, therefore, you can bring korbanot even without a Beit HaMikdash. Does the Ravid disagree with that idea? Or does he say, no, even though you don't have the Kedusha, you still can bring the Korbanot, because the same way that you could bring Korbanot, they brought the Korban Pesach, for example, in the interim period after the Mishkan in Shiloh was destroyed until the Beit HaMikdash was built, they brought Korban Pesach on what was known as a Bamat Tzibur, a community, national altar. They had those places, the Nov and Givon, etc. So if you're able to do it there, maybe you can do it on Har HaBayit as well. But that was Rav Kalisher's argument. The pushback against him was, no, we follow the Rambam. The Ravid is a dat yachid, is a singular opinion, and we can't rely on that as well. But that's one major issue that needs to be discussed. Now, even if,
Any cases of karet?
sorry,
Any cases of karet?
of karet, what do you
Yeah.
mean?
If somebody went up there in the wrong place and they
How do you know?
Okay, so it's either that or high cholesterol. I don't know. Anyway, no lightning bolts have been cited. However, having said this, there is a klal that which is the title of the third section of Gimel, Tuma dechuya b'tzibur, that Tuma is pushed aside the same way that we talk about, let's say, pikuach nefesh doche Shabbat. So there are certain things that push aside other problems. So the idea that if there is Tuma, but it affects the entire tzibur, not just individuals, but affects the entire tzibur, so then the prohibition of sacrificing certain korbanot with when you're in a state of tumah, that isur is removed. Where do we get that idea from? I didn't bring the actual source in terms of the limud, but the basic limud is that it was when we talk about Pesach Sheni, right? If you take a look at the psukim, that Vayavo anashim hatmeim lenefesh adam, the people who were tmeim lenefesh adam, and Chazal were doresh from that it's only when there are individuals who aren't able to bring the korban, but the tzibur as a whole is able to bring the korban, that's when you have Pesach Sheni. But if you have the entire tzibur who are tmeim lenefesh adam, they are in its entirety are tmei meit, so then you bring the korbanot. Okay, so that would be a possibility to push it aside. However, two things that need to be brought into this discussion was that, namely, one is the question of whether it's enough to have just simply say Tuma D'chuya B'tzibur. If you take a look at the line in the Rambam, number 7, in the first line, that's the second line, but it's the first line that's in bold. Ve'ein dochin kol davar nidchel b'makom she'i afshar. There's a question: is Tuma D'chuya B'tzibur? Is it pushed aside, or is it hutra B'tzibur? It becomes permissible. Under these circumstances, it's permissible. Is this something which is a priori permissible, or is it simply b'diavad, post facto? This is the case. Okay, the major distinction is, well, how at ease are we with this dispensation for the fact that there's tuma? Do we say, okay, everything is okay, this is the circumstance, go ahead, or do we say, well, let's try to work whatever we can to avoid the problem? Okay, that's the basic idea between the distinction between hutra and dechuya. We paskin dechuya. The Rambam paskins dechuya. In the Gemara it's a machloket, but the Rambam paskins dechuya, and he says, "Ein dochin kol davar hanidche ela b'makom she'i efshar." Only under circumstances where no other possibility exists. Umipnei zet tzrichat tzitz l'ratzot aleha. That's why you need one of the garments of the Kohen Gadol was the plate that he wore on his forehead, the tzitz, and that tzitz, its role was to act as a kapara for tuma in the Beit HaMikdash. Well, there's always an assumption that there's going to be someone who comes into the Beit HaMikdash unwittingly tamei, and an aveira has happened, and that's going to impact on that person's going to impact on perhaps the tzibur as a whole, and as part of the overall kapara atonement vehicles, one of those atonement vehicles is the tzitz, and its role is to be mechaper for those people who come in. So when we say Tuma D'chuya B'tzibur, we're saying everyone is going in, and everyone is supposed to be doing it, but that doesn't mean there isn't fallout from that. In other words, we are now being told to violate a din. And if you're violating something, was even though under the circumstances it is the least bad of the options. Is it worse to bring a korban in tuma under these circumstances or not to bring the korban? So it's worse not to bring the korban. But it doesn't mean that you didn't do something that needs to be addressed. And so it's addressed through the tzitz, and that takes away the, if you will, any onus of this transgression. Now, if you don't have the tzitz, because we don't have the tzitz, we don't have a kohen gadol, and we don't have anyone wearing the tzitz. So now, under those circumstances where the onus still exists, do you still bring it, or do you say, okay, I'm supposed to bring it when there was a kohen gadol, the kohen gadol would be mechaper. Now I don't have anyone to be mechaper, but it's still better to bring the korban than not to bring the korban. Right? So the Rambam doesn't discuss that. He doesn't give us an answer to that. So that could go either way. So that's one point that needs to be brought. More to the point, if you jump down to number 9, to the bold line with the underline in the middle, aval atmeim betuma acheret, the Rambam says. So he says, the first line in number 9, halacha yud, kol korbanot hatzibur kavua zmanan. So all korbanot tzibur, all public korbanot that have a set time, they have a set time. Lefika kulan dochin et Shabbat. That's why, if you ever ask yourself, how could they bring a korban tamid? How could they bring a korban musaf on Shabbat? You're slaughtering an animal. You're doing a melacha. So the answer is because the Torah said, bring it every day. So if the Torah said, you bring it every day, you bring it every day. If the Torah said, you bring it every Shabbat, you bring it every Shabbat. Okay, that's it. Fine. However, that's only for those korbanot that have a set time. Right? Korbanot that don't have a set time, that you could bring it on a Sunday or you can bring it on a Friday, so you can't bring it on a Shabbat. Fine, good. And then ve'et tumat hamet. It was because these korbanot, you have to bring the korban tamid. So even if everyone is tameh, you bring the korban tamid. We'll say by extension, you have to bring the korban Pesach. So even if everyone is tameh, you bring the korban Pesach. Fine. But that's tumat met. And the Rambam says in the halacha Yud Bet, now to those two lines, aval tmeim betuma acheret, if you are tameh, if some other tuma, kigon, zavin, v'zavot, v'nidot, utmei, sheretz, and veila, etc. All the other types of tuma that can also, it's not just a person who has been come into contact with a dead person. It's any person who is tameh, and that person is includes zavin, zavot, nidot. Any woman who is a nida is can't go on to even today, according to those people who are allowed for it. So you're not allowed to go up. You have to go to the mikvah and go to all of that. If you are tameh of one of those tumot, so then you can't bring a korban. This exemption is only specifically for tameh met. Right? It seems to be gzerat hakatuv. Why it's only tameh met, but it's only tameh met. So today, right? So we are beset by many types of tumot. We're not just dealing with tumat met. We're dealing with with all of these tumot, and so you have to assume that everyone who would go up to bring the korban would make sure that they're not tameh. Now that in itself isn't necessarily a problem. Right? You could say, okay, everyone has to go to mikvah, everyone has to count shiva nekiyim, etc., and do it. If you are possibly a zav, so that's a little bit more difficult because that would require you not just to go to a mikvah, it would require you to go to a natural spring, but you could tell everyone, go to the natural spring, do the dipping, fine. But, here's the big but, there is a additional requirement for certain types of tumah. Not only do you have to go through the purification process, you also have to bring a korban. Bit of a catch-22. In other words, you can't bring a korban till you bring a korban. But so here we have the problem. So that would mean that anyone who perhaps was a zav, you have to get into all the details of what's a zav, and any woman who gave birth, right, a yoledet has to bring a korban as part of her purification process. A zava has to bring a korban as part of the purification process. So any of those people would not be able to join. Now, if you take those out, percentage-wise, do you still have a tzibur? Right? You say, okay, all of those people aren't going to be able to join. We're very sorry. But everyone else can go. But now, well, statistically, is it rove enough? Or do you need more than a rove? Etc. How are you going to count it? It's going to be very complicated in terms of all of this. Also, just an aside, this is assuming that everyone is on board. In other words, that you are now saying you have 100% of the Jewish people who are interested in bringing a Korban Pesach, and now you have to sort of winnow it out of those people who are going to fall within the category and those who are not going to fall into the category. But if you already are starting with just let's say, we'll be generous and say a third of the Jewish people want to bring a Korban Pesach, and the other 2/3, think you're off the wall, right? So then, do you have the tzibur at all? Right? So that's a question that needs to be discussed. Next point. Right? We started a little bit late. Still have 12 minutes in the official time. We'll see what the referee does. Whether somebody lifts up a flag and gives me a few extra minutes. Rambam. In the next question is, who's a Kohen? Right? Can we assume? Right? I'm a Kohen because my father told me I was a Kohen. His father told me he was a Kohen. Right? My father never met his grandfather.
You paid the annual license.
What?
You paid the annual license.
I paid the annual license fee. Yes. But does this now, is that good enough to act as a Kohen? Nobody else can sprinkle the blood, etc. Do that part of the avodah. So here, this is already discussed in the Gemara. And the Rambam says, Kol HaKohanim, number 11, Kol HaKohanim b'zman hazeh b'chazaka hem Kohanim, ve'ein ochlin ela b'katshei gvul. So, we have a chazakah, we have an assumption that anyone who thinks he's a Kohen is a Kohen. However, as a result, because it's only based on that assumption, it's not based on, we don't have any proof positive that we can assert that that's the case. Ein ochlin ela b'katshei gvul. So you can only eat those. The Kohanim cannot eat korbanot. They can only eat those things that are kedusha outside, namely trumot. V'hu, excuse me. V'shetiyeh truma shel divreihem. Aval truma shel Torah, v'chala shel Torah, ein ochalota ela kohen miyuchas. In other words, if I know that this is challah, this is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why we, let's say, when we are making dough on Shabbat, on Erev Shabbat or whatever, and now have to be mafrish challah, why we burn it and we don't give it to a kohen, because a kohen wouldn't be able to use it anyway. Right? He's not allowed to eat it, despite the fact that he's tamei also. But he's not able to. We don't believe that our kohanim are real kohanim. This can lead to a completely different shear, just maybe at some point, was, who's a Kohen? There's a well-known story about the Vilna Gaon that whenever he would meet another Kohen, he would give him 5 shkalim. Because he said, I'm a Bechor, that I know, right? And I don't know whether my father did the Pidyon. And I've done the Pidyon now 73 times, but who knows if every Kohen, any of those Kohanim are really Kohanim. So he gave him 5 shkalim. So we don't know who really is a Kohen. So if we're dealing with serious stuff, D'oraitas. So it's one thing if we allow people to get the first aliyah. Another thing, going up and saying a bracha is a question. Some people say maybe they shouldn't be saying the bracha. How can that happen? But okay, we'll allow for that. But you're going to now say that you're going to bring korbanot based on that, right? Risk that. So the Chatam Sofer, right, the son-in-law of Rabbi Akiva Eger, and roughly the contemporary of the, actually also a little bit older than the Rav Kalisher. So in one of his letters to Rabbi Akiva Eger wrote to his son-in-law, told him about this, and the Chatam Sofer wrote back, and we have the letter, and he says, the next side, Uma shekatav, in the bold print, Ma shekatav miyuchus kuna nired lo kasha midei. Right? How could, he's going back to that same story about Rabbi Yechiel Mipariz. How could Rabbi Yechiel do it? They don't have Kohanim. That's something that the Kafta of Ferach had already raised as a question that he meant to ask, but he forgot to. Deman lemalan de lo yakriv achazaka. Who said that you can't base yourself on a chazakah? You're right. If we're saying, should he be eating or not eating, don't eat. Why? You don't have to eat truma. Don't eat truma. But here we have a need for a korban. We have a person who has a tradition in his family that he's a kohen. We'll let him work based on chazakah. Right? If it turns out that he's not. But there are going to be some of them who are going to be kohanim. Right? So it's going to happen. So our fear, if you will, of this, at least according to the Chatam Sofer, isn't sufficient. Yeah.
Just I understand all this with regard to korbanot in general, but with regard to the korban Pesach, when it was first done,
right,
everybody did it,
right,
in their own home,
right. But that changed.
Now,
in other words,
why would that have changed?
Okay, because
why would
so there's a whole list. Right?
It doesn't make any sense why it would have changed.
So there is your question is excellent, right? And as I don't want to. No. As you always, I always say the difference between when a person says that's an excellent question and a good question. Excellent questions have answers. Yeah. People say it's a good question, he doesn't have an answer. But now, so that's an excellent question. But you're right. If you are looking at there are many things that happened in Mitzrayim that we don't keep or wasn't kept in the Beit Mikdash. There was the Mishnah list that has a list of the distinctions between Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach L'Dorot. Right? And each one of them is learnt out from various limudim, etc. So you don't have to be standing there with your walking stick and getting ready to leave and all of that. And we don't sprinkle blood. No one ever sprinkled blood after that first Pesach Mitzrayim on the doorposts and the lintels, etc. It's true, and this is perhaps this is a shir in of itself. Whereas every Jewish home, in effect, right, a mizbeach, and that's the idea. And every Jew was a potential kohen, right, at that moment, and that's the symbolism. But once we make the shift to already in the Mishkan, right?
Yeah, but when Yoshua
and then Yoshua again, it's being done as a public and communal sacrifice in the Gilgal. That's where it happens, but that in Yoshua. In other words, every time it needs to have the public question. So why should that shift? That's more of a good question.
Yeah.
Okay. There we now have to be thinking, why should that shift happen? Right? And that's for a different discussion. Okay, but halachically the shift happened.
Yeah,
okay.
All right.
But you can trace it to Psukim as well. When you look at the difference between Perek Yud Bet and Perek Yud Gimel in Sefer Shemot, right, where Perek Yud Bet is where it's before and Perek Yud Gimel is after. So that has that. Okay, maybe in one of the next year, maybe I'll talk about it. But now getting back to this, so the bottom line of number 12, in my humble opinion, the Chatam Sofer says, Lo tzrichim lekohen miyuchas. You don't need it. Right? That's one hurdle that you can get over just by virtue of the assumption of kahuna.
Yeah. How would they define a kohen miyuchas?
A kohen miyuchas is a person, and I don't know, this is, you're going to need, this is why you need an Eliyahu Navi to accompany the Mashiach. you need something. Back in the day, they would have actual, a signed documents of people saying, I can testify that this person, at the very least, there was someone who was on the Mizbeach, right? This, and you would have an official document with showing that I was on the Mizbeach, or my father was on the Mizbeach, etc. Right? And at a certain point in time, right, people stopped keeping those documents. There's it's definitely an apocryphal story, but there is a story attributed to Rav Haigon. So we're talking about the 9th century, 10th century, where he was in Yerushalayim, and there was a minhag on Hoshana Rabbah to go around the walls of the city. Right? All the Jews would go around, led by the Kohanim in Yerushalayim, going around. And in the story, Eliyahu Hanavi comes to him, and he asks Eliyahu Hanavi, "Why hasn't Mashiach come yet?" So Eliyahu Hanavi comes. So this is before that Hoshana Rabbah says, "You make sure every Kohen who's available does the hakafa, and then Mashiach will come." So he does it, and Mashiach doesn't come. And he's, he meets Eliyahu Hanavi. Said, "What happened? I did it." And Eliyahu Hanavi laughs at him, and he says, "All of those Kohanim that are walking there, this is while the hakafa is going on. He says, all those Kohanim who are walking there. You see that one in the back? He's the one blind in one eye, and he's like limping along. He's the only Kohen. Right? That's it. All the rest of them, right? They think they're Kohen, but they're not Kohen. Right? But we don't know. Right? The fact that there's such an apocryphal story exists, we have historical record that was indeed a minhag to go around, make a hakafa of the Yerushalayim. But the fact that the story exists is a very telling story, right? Whether Eliyahu Hanavi actually came to the Rav Haigon. This assertion of the Tam Sofer is not at all accepted by everyone. I just brought one line from a later source, somebody who wrote an essay as a response to the Drishat Zion. He called it Drishat Zion v'Yerushalayim. He was Rav David of Karlin, who was basically, Karlin is Karlin Hasidim, but it's a suburb of Pinsk. And for 50 years, he was he was the Rav of Karlin. Anyway, he wrote this his Child Tshuva. It's called Shelat David, and that's where this kuntras can be found. And there he says, I said, no, you need to have someone's Kohen Miyuchas, because the Chazakah doesn't can tell you maybe that your father was a Kohen, his father was a Kohen, can't tell you, right, if along the lines, right, there weren't affairs that went on, God forbid, or there were, women were raped by Cossacks, etc. There's no way for you to know and assume that this is, even if you know that you're a Kohen, today there are too many problems that have existed for too many generations that can allow us to even assume the Chazakah works. Okay, that's that. So we're at 12. Do I have extra time or what? So we'll go another few minutes. I'll just mention other problems. I won't go through all of it. Now, right? Big day kahuna. Okay, we'll assume that I'm a Kohen, right? And I don't have to be a Kohen Gadol, so I don't need all of the 8 garments of the Kohen Gadol. But I do need the 4 garments of a regular Kohen. Okay? Now those 4 garments are okay except for one. What's the one? The 4 garments are the trousers, the jacket, the hat. Okay? So those we have descriptions, and they're made of linen. And so, okay, you can make those bigadim. The problem is the belt. The belt of the Kohen, a regular Kohen. So there's one shita that says along the lines of what the Kohen Gadol wore on Yom Kippur. He also wore 4 begadim, and he had the same 4 begadim. His belt was a white linen belt. However, so there are those who say that a regular Kohen can wear the white linen belt as well. But that's a minority opinion. The accepted opinion is that the Kohen Hedyot, the regular Kohen, the rest of the year, wore a very colorful belt. And the belt was made of tchelet, argaman, tolat shani, the blue, the purple, the scarlet, and the shesh, the linen. And that was woven together into a very colorful belt that the Kohen Hedyot would wear. Now, this is the way that the Rambam follows the halacha, and he says, as a result, first of all, if you don't have all 4 begadim, so you're called what's known as mechusar begadim, you're missing a garment, and it's forbidden for a Kohen to serve if you don't have the bigdei of the bigdei kahuna. This is based on last week's parsha, that basically as part of the sanctification was the placement of the garments. So if you don't have the garments, so it's not just that you're out of uniform, you are disqualified to act as a Kohen. So you need to have the belt. That's one of the garments. And if you don't have the belt, so you can't. But now the question is, well, it's kilayim. Right? It's kilayim because it has linen, and the other 3, the tchelet, the argaman, and the tolat shanei, have to be wool threads. That's the reason why today, if you're wearing a linen talit katan, if you're wearing tzitzit that's made of linen, you can't wear the strings, because you're allowed to wear strings of wool. The strings themselves have to be made of wool. You can wear the strings of wool on a linen garment, providing you have tchelet. So if you have tchelet, that's one of the cases where, to use the term, aseh dochel lo taseh, the positive command of wearing tzitzit, the positive command of wearing bigdei kahuna, pushes aside the negative command of wearing kilai. Okay, but you have to know for sure that you're doing it, right? The Kohen, to the extent that a Kohen, I'm just saying this outside because of the time, the Kohen, a regular Kohen, when he has this bigdei kahuna on, and it's the end of the day, right? Does he have to get out of his garments right away? So the answer is he can keep his garments on except for the belt. Because when he's not on duty, it becomes kilayim. It's only when you're on duty. So if you're the Kohen in the lounge of the Beit HaMikdash, you have to take off your belt because you can't be wearing it when you're not serving in the Mikdash. So now the question is, do we have enough certitude? Let's say I'm wearing tchelet right now on my, but do we have enough certitude to say that what we think is tchelet, and certainly before they had it, is tchelet? And do we know what argaman is? And do we know what tolat shani is? So that's another problem. Another problem, just to go down the line. There's a Gemara that tells us that when they rebuilt the second Beit HaMikdash, they didn't know where the Mizbeach was. They had the whole complex, but they didn't know exactly where there was a Mizbeach. And the Gemara says that the different miraculous ways that they saw it. Either they saw a vision of a Mizbeach, and Michael, the angel, was serving on it, and they knew where to go, right? Or they saw where the ashes of Yitzchak were, which in itself, because that's another Akedah shir, okay, right? Or just simply that the Nevi'im said, over there, right? But now, if you go to the, so if back in the day, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Gamliel, they had at least the framework of the Mizbeach, they knew the place of the Mizbeach, and they could bring the Korban there. But, today, can we do that? Perhaps if there was extensive archaeological work done on Har HaBayit, we'd be able to discover the foundations of the Mizbeach from 2,000 years ago. right? But now, even assuming that the Muslims didn't destroy it at some point, but now it's based on guesswork. Is guesswork good enough? So that's another problem that has to be developed. Okay, we'll skip that because we'll get to a more broader point. Finally, last 2 points. Right? One is the question of what's the purpose of bringing a korban in the first place. Okay, so it's l'reach nichoach, right? It should be a pleasant aroma before God, and we have the following. Right, Psukim say l'reach nichoach, and we have a following pasuk. Pasuk says that there's a source number 21. V'natati et arechem chorba. This is in the Tochacha at the end of Sefer Vayikra. I will destroy your cities. V'hashimoti et mikdashechem, and I will lay waste to your mikdash. V'lo ariach bereach nichochachem, and I will not smell the reach nichoach anymore. So there are those who want to say that as long as we're in a state of korban, right, you can't have the reach nichoach. So you'll say, 1 second, Rabbi Gamliel brought the korban. How could he bring the korban? So there, interestingly enough, and I'm not going to read it inside because of the time, but that's in source 23, the Netziv wants to claim that korban Pesach is being brought for other reasons than reach nichoach. The term reach nichoach is never found in korban Pesach. And the only discussion of actual korbanot that were brought after the korban is only korban Pesach. So korban Pesach, perhaps because of the national implications of the korban Pesach, that can be brought, even though we're saying the first korban Pesach, after all, was brought before we're still in Galut as well. So you can bring the korban Pesach, even though it's not reach nichoach. So, just to sum up, you can see from all of these problems, right, that are there, that it's a serious discussion, and there might be room if you are going to each point, in each juncture, say, okay, I'll rely on this shita, I'll rely on that shita, I'll rely on that shita, and you put it all together, you can build a case for bringing korbanot today, right? But in number 24, the Tzitz Eliezer, after a very long tshuva, he basically says, don't do this at home. It's not, this is not something, the question, but I don't want to deal with his question, which is a funny question of itself, but don't have time. But I do want to finish with the last piece from Rav Kook. Rav Kook also wrote extensively about this, a lot more to be said about Rav Kook's position. He was also basically opposed. But we won't talk about Rav Kook and the details right now. However, he, in a letter not related to this, different letter, he made the following statement. And I've heard Rav Amital make the statement of other people based on Rav Kook, and it's something which has implications beyond the discussion of this year, but also to the discussion of this year. Rav Kook makes the following philosophical observation. The overall discussion is a question of what individual roles that we play in this world in terms of hashgacha pratit, in terms of divine providence, what roles different nations play, etc. And in this discussion, he has the following statement. Hine, I'll just read it in full, this paragraph. Number 25. Hine k'dei l'malei b'maaseh hashilton ha'le'umi. In order to fully fulfill our national mission, so we need our energies and our capabilities to be in their fullest throttle. So that's an ideal state. We're not in an ideal state. So we don't stop people from doing what they need to do just because we're not in the ideal state. So the essence of our national spirit is always, thank God, alive. David Melech Yisrael chai v'kayam. Okay? David Melech Yisrael chai. Okay, however, Zot eitzat Hashem shehifli etza. But here is an incredible, if you will, insight that God has. What is the idea? Higdil tushiyah shekfi oto hamiut shekochot ha'umah mitma'atin. Based on, if you will, in proportion to the strength of the nation waning and waxing, Ken yihiyeh nigra koach hayicholet. So too will the practical possibility and ability to fulfill the mission will be limited in relation to the spiritual barometer of the nation. And as a result, he says, "Uminiyat hayicholet hilanu le'edal chefetz Hashem." He said we shouldn't take a look at things which are currently impossible and necessarily bemoan that fact, but we should view it as being the indication of what God wants. Uminiyat hachefetz yesh la harbe drachim, and the impediment to the will can happen in many different ways. L'fa'amim minia, that was a typo, I was typing it. Minia, not a hey, it's a nun. Ma'asit, k'mo yirat malchut u'chiyotze b'zeh. Perhaps it is a practical, political impediment and impossibility that stops something from happening. U'lefa'amim minia ruchanit, and sometimes it's a spiritual impediment. That's where the source of saying, there are times if you see something which is wrong, but you should bite your tongue if you know that your tochacha, your rebuke is not going to be accepted. Know when to talk, know when not to talk. It's based on saying, this is the reality, the spiritual reality, and accept it. Know what you can change and what you can't change. וכשישנם מניעות כאלו, הננו מרוצים מזה, מפני שאנו מכירים שכך הוא רצון ההשגחה העליונה בעתים כאלה. This is God's will. So if you say, why don't we have a Sanhedrin today? And why don't we have the ability for capital punishment? And why don't we have the ability to build a Beit HaMikdash? And why do we not have the ability, in this case, to even bring a Korban Pesach? But we do have the ability to go up to Har HaBayit. And we do have the ability to go to Yerushalayim during Chol HaMoed in tens of thousands of people. Right? So that's an indication of where we are now, as opposed to where we were a few decades or centuries ago, but also how far we still have to go. Right? And when we look around the world, or just look around our country right now, with all of the divisions that we have and all of the issues and the implications, right? To say, in this particular case, are we ready to bring a Korban Pesach because of Tu Mahutra B'Tzibur, because we're one Tzibur together trying to bring a Korban? So, depending on what traffic allows me to, get out today because of the day of disruption, my guess is that we're not there yet, right? But Ezrat Hashem, we still have 4 weeks. So hopefully everything will work out between now and then. Okay. Shabbat Shalom.
I still think we should be able to do our own Korban Pesach. However that changed.
It did change.
Good to see you again. Last time we sat together at the concert. When the people became Rabbanim and Rabbanim.
Right. Yes,
Very nice.
that's Harel.
We received an apology that you weren't